Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last GERPISA International Seminar for the term. Yes, we welcome today Mattias and Näsman. Please correct me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, from Umeå University in Sweden, that will present to us is doctoral work on the political economy of emission standards, politics, business, and the making of vehicle emission regulations in Sweden and in Europe. His work focuses on the period between 1960 and 1980 and analyzes the developments in terms of emission standards in Sweden, but putting Sweden into a European context. Mattias will explain his work in detail, but the work explains how Sweden potentially had a leading role in terms of setting stricter standards and paved the way for Europe to follow, but encountered some technical and political obstacles, if we can define them this way, that in a way or another affected the process and the outcomes of the whole European debate on emission regulations in the years analyzed. The thesis discusses the case from an economic history perspective, but of course also focuses on political economy factors that are not only of current interest to the present debate on the just transition that is central in our GERPISA debate this year and has been central in the past few years, but also raises very important issues that can be connected to other debates. First of all, like the relationship between the national governments, like national cases like Sweden in this case, and the European institutions, the relationship between a national institutional environment and the industrial sphere, including an industrial lobby that can hamper policy decisions. This, of course, is relevant also, can be discussed in relation to the current Green Deals and the just transition debate. There is also one of the aspects that Mattias raises in his thesis is the interdependence between emission standards and the actual technical requirements and the infrastructure needed to support the setting of these standards. So these are all like crucial questions that Mattias will analyze with reference to this specific period, but that Samuel Klebaner from the Université Paris 13 will help put in perspective and relate to current times, also building on his own work that you may know already, but Samuel may want to share again on European environmental regulations and car makers strategies. Samuel published a book with GERPISA as well. We can share everything in the chat here. So this will be the conversation that we will have in the first part of the seminar before opening to the floor. I'm sure there will be an interesting and lively discussion given the centrality of this topic to our own network. I leave it here. Mattias will give a 40-45 minutes presentation, then Samuel will follow. Thank you very much for joining, and see you later in the debate. I leave it to you, Mattias. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much. I will try to share the screen here. can you see the, not my notes? Yes, good. So thank you, Lorenza, for a great introduction. Thank you for organizing the practicalities of this seminar. I must say that I really much appreciate the opportunity to present my thesis results and thesis work to such a community of experts on the automobile industry, on the car industry, and on its current and past challenges and opportunities. So in March 2019, I had a very pleasant experience of presenting a very early draft of the first part of the thesis at the JERPISA Young Researchers Day in Paris, where I got some very good criticism and suggestions. So after this, I reworked the manuscript considerably and defended in September this year. So again, I want to thank you, Lorenza, for organizing the practicalities, and also to Samuel for agreeing to discuss the thesis, which I'm very thankful for. I'm also looking forward really to the broader discussion as well, specific as to which the connections you draw with current challenges and current debates, for which I'm also interested in continuing doing research in. So I'm currently affiliated, as Lorenza said, with Umeå University, which is situated in the northern parts of Sweden. So I'm hoping to continue to do research on sort of the to adapt the historical experiences and knowledge from that to the more current transition. So I will begin the presentation by mentioning one of the historical problems that the thesis seeks to address. And there is a general notion in the comparative literature of environmental regulation in general, but also in this sense, the vehicle emission regulation, that European regulations on vehicle emission standards lag behind the United States in terms of stringency by as many as 20 years. And one way to show this, sort of the stringency gap, is to look at when various regulations were published in the US and in Europe or in the EC. So on the left-hand side, can you see my mouse pointer if I do like this? Yeah, good. So on the left-hand side, you can see the United States Clean Air Act amendments of 1970, which mandated a reduction of vehicle emissions by 90%. On the right-hand side, you can see the EEC Council Directive from 1991, which is generally seen as the directive that sort of closed the gap, stringency gap between Europe, or at least the EEC, and the US. So some of the arguments put forward to sort of explain why this gap happened, or is that the European response was slow owing to a relatively low public demand for drastic emission reductions prior to the 1980s. If you compare them to quite radical public demand for drastic emission reductions in the US in the late 1960s. And there also the explanation that there were high levels of disagreement in the EEC Council over the severity of motor vehicle air pollution as an environmental problem. Another explanations put forward argues that vehicle emission regulations within the EEC were more focused on protecting trade within the common market than protecting the environment, really. So those explanations goes hand in hand. So I also want to mention some of the debates that the thesis seeks to take part in. And the first one concerns the debate whether or not international trade, or differently, international market integration, is beneficial to or detrimental to environmental protection. I discussed some of that in the thesis. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but one thing that is relevant to note is in relationship to the vehicle emissions and international trade, at least, is that vehicle emission standards, as I think most of you know, but there might be some sort of that I will make some points that you already know, but still for the sake of the argument, I will try to make them. So vehicle emission standards define market access. So in the sense that if a manufacturer cannot comply with the regulation, it will be shut out from selling cars on that particular market. And assuming that if you, as multinational firms, as the car or automobile firms are, it wouldn't be necessarily a major problem if you have technical standards that are the same across all the markets that the manufacturer is active in. But if you have dissimilar standards, so standards that requires different technical requirements to comply, this could lead to markets being fragmented, which in terms increase transaction costs and generate this economies of scale for all producers active on those markets. Why? Because it creates shorter production series, because you have to adapt production to different technical requirements across markets, requires post-manufacturing adjustment and additional costs for gathering information. And as you know, is that the fact that low-cost production through massive scales has been a paradigmatic feature of the car industry from the early 20th century, makes this a specific problem for the car industry. But another thing about standards in trade in this sense is that it could not only lead to conflicts between the regulator and the regulated firm, but it could also lead to state conflicts, conflicts between states because of the idea about neo-protectionism. And that is the idea that sort of governments can implement environmental standards as a covert way of protecting their domestic industries. And the idea here is to not say much about it, but just to recognize that as soon as a government implements emission standards that are dissimilar from the norm elsewhere, this will raise conflicts between states as well. So that is sort of the point here. A second issue concerns sort of the historiography of European vehicle emission governance. I'm not going to go into detail in explaining that either, but a notable fact about this literature is that it has mostly looked at the period after 1983. Another notable fact is that there's a general understanding in the literature that the EEC Council have never really implemented standards developed within the framework of the common market until the 1990s. Instead, the EEC adopted regulations that had been developed within the framework of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe by translating these regulations into EEC directives. So the studies focused on European vehicle emission regulations have in fact almost exclusively studied policymaking within the European economic community and not in Europe as a whole, without exploring sort of developments within the UNECE or in non-EEC states. There's also, because of the focus on the period after 1983, they haven't really looked at either how the energy crisis affected the stringency of emission standards or what really happened during the 1970s. So the goal of the thesis has been to sort of address these issues as well by tracing the evolution and origins of vehicle emission standards from 1960. A third debate concerns the power of business of environmental governance, and in generally, there's a lot of European integration literature on this. Says that sort of the car industry has essentially controlled this development of this regulation since the 1970s. So there's something that I want to readdress and also look at quite closely at the role of what role the experts have played in terms of policymaking, because they're generally, I mean, the literature on expertise is generally situates experts within as essential pieces of policymaking. So I want to explore what experts, sort of what influence do they have in this policymaking process. Briefly then about the framework and methods used in the thesis, I follow three set of actors as business organizations. There is the car industry, governments, and techno-scientific experts. And these experts are essentially those assigned as experts, usually by governments, to take part in the policy process, to say something about technical and scientifically complex issues, although they're not sort of experts on every piece of the puzzle, but they're expert on policymaking in a sense of techno-scientific policymaking. I rely on archival studies. So I looked at archival studies, 3 committees in Sweden, from archives from ministries, agencies in Sweden, and the Swedish Car Industry Association, Bil Sweden, now called. as well as international organizations such as the UNECE, Council of Europe, and also published sources of government reports in Sweden, US, the EEC, Norway, and well, a lot of other places. So although there's quite a heavy focus on Swedish archives, I should say that there's not only, let's say, Swedish information in there, but there is a lot of collected material from a lot of different places too. So it's not just what Swedes thought about it at the time. And I do this by looking closely at, by placing technology at the center of analysis. So I look at how these various actors understand technology as a way of as a solution to environmental problems, or as a sort of an obstacle to solving environmental problems in various ways. And I also adopt a transnational approach in this, and looking specifically at how knowledge flows within various types of networks and in and through Sweden, and how knowledge circulates on a European scale. So I think this is known to most of you. But the US has been a leader since the 1960s in terms of regulating vehicle emissions. And there are some points of the policy process or policy development that I think is important to understand from the European perspective, because European actors often look to the US as a sort of to gauge their own progress and to look at how far they should go in turn. California, as most of you know, has been in the driver's seat, and that is specifically because of the prevalence of photochemical smog as a very nasty environmental problem since the 1940s. And photochemical smog is created when you have high concentrations of hydrocarbons, that is unburned fuel, or volatile organic compounds, as they're called nowadays, and oxides of nitrogen and sunlight. And then it creates a thick brownish sort of smog that irritates your eyes and makes it difficult to breathe and so on. In terms of the most important regulation here is that in 1970, the US Congress adopted a landmark US Clean Air Act amendments, which required 90% reductions of carbon monoxide, CO, hydrocarbons, HC, and oxides of nitrogen, NOx. The remarkable thing about this is, firstly, that it was very sort of radical in terms of perceived emission reductions. The other thing that the literature has pointed out is that it was a technologically forcing regulation. So it essentially assumed, for compliance, it assumed the technology that was not already developed anywhere. So it instigated sort of an innovation race in the industry in general. But there was a technology implied, and that is the catalytic converter technology. You can see a catalyst here. It's essentially it's a can placed between the engine and the exhaust pipe, and its insides is coated with noble metals such as palladium and rhodium, which is used to oxidize or reduce the pollutants of the three pollutants essentially. And catalysts have been used for quite some time, but they showed some promise. But there was a major drawback with them, and it is that they required unleaded gasoline, because if you have lead in gasoline, which was common, which was a norm in Europe and the US and everywhere else at the time, lead sticks to the catalytic coating and makes it and it reduces the efficiency of the catalytic converter quite substantially. Knowing that catalysts would probably be the way in which the car industry would try to solve this issue, the United States Environmental Protection Agency required gas stations to offer unleaded gasoline in 1975. So it's quite easily solved from the perspective of the US. However, there were other problems too in terms of the catalyst, because there are trade-offs in controlling carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons, which you can look at the left-hand side. That has to do with air-fuel ratio. So to control hydrocarbons and oxides of nitrogen, you have to have a lean air-fuel ratio. But if you want to control, let's see if I said this right, hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide, lean air-fuel ratio. But if you want to control oxides of nitrogen, you should have a rich air-fuel ratio, essentially. And this also goes for catalysts. And it was difficult to develop engine systems that could actually control all three pollutants without incurring massive penalties for in terms of fuel economy. But in 1976, Swedish Volvo and later Saab developed or introduced a three-way catalytic converter solution on the Californian market in the fall of 1976, which could control all three pollutants at remain sort of fuel economy. And although it was on a few models, so it wasn't really for all Volvo's models, but or Saab's models, but still, it sort of was a proof of concept, and it showed U.S. regulators that it was actually possible to reach these emission reductions without incurring too much negative effects on fuel economy or other things. For various reasons, however, relating to that the US car industry had to adapt their own solutions, and they were struggling with the outcomes of the energy crisis, and a perceived lack of technical solutions for quite a while. The final sort of implementation of the Clean Air Act amendments did not happen until model year 1983. So it was quite radical, this sort of the US development. But one thing to note is that the US regulators didn't really have to focus on much how this would lead to response in terms of international response from the international community, because the US industry was not really dependent on accessing foreign markets, at least the US industry with production in the US. So if you look at the exports in terms of passenger car exports in terms of production, the US industry didn't really export that much. It was production in the US was aimed to the US market. But if you look instead on the export share for the European industry, was quite substantially higher, and sort of the post-war reconstruction and the growth of in the post-war periods of the European industry was very much dependent on having access to export markets. So from the beginning, it was quite more difficult for Europeans to achieve similar things. So the economic historian Barry Eichengreen says that the European reconstruction was essentially dependent on two things: raising investment levels, which was essentially solved by the Marshall Plan, and secondly, to reduce tariff barriers that isolated markets, tariff barriers and quotas. So the second thing was sort of solved by the creation of the European Economic Community, which created a common market, but also by negotiations within the Global General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, the GATT, and partially also through organizations such as the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. Within this sort of in a general idea to integrate European markets by lowering tariff barriers, there also became a functional need not to re-raise new barriers, so technical barriers to trade, which will then threaten the bargaining market integration of European car markets. And this was sort of unique for the European experience if we compare it to the US. Another comparison is that cross-border transportation was a major issue if we compare at least international cross-border transportation if we compare it to the US. And one of the organizations working on these issues was the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which was established in the 1940s by the UN to facilitate the reconstruction of Europe and sort of foster integration, and specifically integration between the West and the East, West and Eastern Europe, but also to look at sort of technical and standardizing practices. And for this, in terms of cars, they created a working party for the construction of vehicles, WP29. And this is still, I think most of you know, this organization is still around today. But it was formed in 1952. And it was composed of governmental experts, mostly from Western and Eastern, mostly from Western, but also from Eastern Europe. There were also peak level associations, such as the International Car Industry Federation, the BPICA. I don't dare to pronounce the French words, but it's OICA now, anyways. So related to cross-border transportation, the issue emerged sort of having different regulation made it difficult for trucks, for instance, to travel across Europe because there were different weight limitations on how much a truck should weigh, for instance. But there were also a number of safety issues related to sort of how to construct the vehicles to make it more safe. They were coming up from European governments and European sort of national agencies responsible for these things. So they were beginning to discussing how to standardize these issues and how to think about them not to impede cross-border transport and not to impede trade too much. So the WP29 became a center for knowledge circulation of vehicle safety quite early on, but they also adapted that to vehicle emissions, and they first time discussed vehicle emissions as an area of interest in 1959, and discussing whether or not to develop standardized regulations that could be adopted throughout Europe. And I should say, eventually, WP29 developed regulations that were published by the Université as sort of regulations that were free for any countries to adopt. So it was sort of a voluntary framework in general. If we look at when we started to look at vehicle emissions, started to become sort of an area of interest by experts and governments in the early 1960s, specifically related to sort of the general interest in air pollution from industries and other sources as well. If you look at the conception, the conceptions of the environmental problem in terms of US and in Europe, I already mentioned that in the US, it was the hydrocarbons and oxides of nitrogen was the pollutant of most interest because they were sort of responsible for creating photochemical smog. In Europe, on the other hand, most observers said that, well, we don't have as much photochemical smog here, or at least we haven't really had any occurrences of it in the early 1960s. But we know that carbon monoxide is a toxic gas, and it's also sort of a proxy of other pollutants. So that is sort of, it became quite early on the regulatory focus of European experts and governments. And it for quite as long also sort of stuck to the problem conception was up until the 1980s in the European Commission also thought that carbon monoxide was a major issue. Photochemical smog is not an issue in Europe. Another difference, which I think you know, is that there were different conceptions of the sort of driving cycle, and the driving cycle is the way to imitate driving on the actual road in a sense. So in the US, this is the first sort of Californian, but then adopted as a federal driving cycle, and this is the European one. And I think you recognize this because it's also has been part of the new European driving cycle until fairly recently, which until fairly recently was sort of the driving cycle used in Europe. And this was developed in 1965 within Working Party for the construction of vehicles, with sort of transnational expertise investigating these issues. So one of the conclusions regarding sort of the early conceptions about motor vehicle air pollution as a problem is that I think that why the problem conception came to differ has more to do sort of with how the experts formulated sort of the environmental problem, rather than that the European experts wanted to protect against the US industry in this sense. So I'm not going to go into more detail on this. We can talk about it later if you're interested. What about Sweden then? Sweden was France and West Germany were the first countries to begin to do research on motor vehicle air pollution, vehicle emissions in general, its control and so on, its effect on health, but also were the first to look at maybe the needs to regulate it. Sweden came third, I would say, specifically with the creation by the Ministry of Transportation of the expert group on exhaust emissions in 1965. It was composed of a number of experts from the government agencies, essentially, but also among them were some independent experts or semi-independent experts. But there were also two experts from the car industry, from Swedish Volvo and Saab. The Ministry of Transportation also formed sort of the Studsvik Exhaust Emission Laboratory. And this laboratory was state funded, and it was used to sort of establish sort of the baseline for what do average emissions in the Swedish car fleet look like, and how far can we push it by adopting new technology. So the specific focus was to test new technologies to see whether or not it was possible to reduce emissions by applying technology. It was also a clear purpose, at least the experts in the expert group, specifically from the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, said that we should set vehicle emission standards according to the best available technology principle. This was the same technology used to control emissions from industrial sources and so on. But their interpretation of this was that we should design standards to mimic the US regulations in order to introduce those technical solutions on the Swedish market. That was essentially their idea. So in terms of research in general, Sweden was really trailing behind France and West Germany, who stood for the brunt of the research. But the state in this sense had more control, and specifically it was independent from the car industry. In West Germany, the car industry had more control. There was also sort of the German Engineering Association were mostly developing for responsible for research. And in France, the industry had more control over sort of at least the basic and applied research. I should also say that Studsvik built up quite an extensive transnational network of experts, so leading experts in France, in Germany, in the UK and the US, not so much with the French experts, but still. So there was quite some knowledge circulating early on in Europe. After the Working Party for the Construction of Vehicles had adopted sort of the first driving cycle, they also invited countries to propose their own emission, or they said the proposal for European emission limits. And Sweden was on board with European driving cycle, saying that is good because driving patterns in Sweden or in Europe look more like each other than they do with the US, so we should have a distinct European driving cycle. And Sweden proposed sort of a uniform set of standards. And here, these are sort of the proposals for the first European vehicle emission standards for carbon monoxide per grams of carbon monoxide per test. And you can see that Sweden proposed uniform emission limits. And France and West Germany, they had different proposals, which raised quite some concern within the European Commission. So France proposed emission limits based on the weight of the vehicle. So the heavier the vehicle, the more it should be able to pollute or to emit. And West Germany had a similar idea, although it was based on fuel consumption. So the more fuel used during the test, the more the car should be allowed to emit, in a sense. West Germany and France agreed to compromise. So West Germany adopted sort of a weight-based approach. And I don't know if you can see this here. I have, but on the right-hand side, on the far edge, is the sort of the final compromise within the WP29. So you can see there's a weight-based limit, which is quite unlike the Swedish proposal. So Sweden said that this is not enough, or the expert group said it's not enough, so we're going to adopt our own regulations. So Sweden adopted its own regulation in 1968, before there were any sort of international regulation in place. And it was based on European driving cycle, but the Swedish standards. And in 1970, WP29 agrees on what will become Regulation 15, which was the sort of European vehicle emission regulation up until the 1990s. Yes. And this was just before US Congress adopted the Clean Air Act amendments. And I think at least it has some impact on Europe, specifically because I think it shifted the frontier of the technologically imaginable. So the US had adopted a goal to reduce emissions by 90% until 1975, 1976. As I told you, it was postponed, but still it was sort of the goal then. But Sweden had a sort of the implicit goal to follow the US all the time. So there were also the Swedish expert group and quite some others also focused on adopting similar requirements. Said that if the most sort of biggest car market in the world can adopt these standards, why should we, essentially? West Germany in 1971, they adopted, the new government adopted national goals in an environmental protection program to reduce emissions, vehicle emissions by 90% to 1980 compared to 1969. And Switzerland also had similar goals based on sort of because of the US Clean Air Act amendments. So some countries were also focusing on trying to push the European regulation further. So Sweden and Switzerland pushes within WP29, for European adoption of US standards for model year 1973 as a first step. They weren't pushing for the adoption of the Clean Air Act amendments yet, but the standards for model year 1973 included oxides of nitrogen limits, and not only carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons, which was the case of the European standards. Germany was still sort of cautious. There were quite big discrepancies here within the Working Party for Construction of Vehicles, where you had Sweden and Switzerland pushing quite high emission reductions, Germany a bit below, and then you had France, Belgium, Italy, and in the bottom you had the UK, who joined the EEC in 1973. So the UK has been quite a laggard in this case. The role of the International Car Industry Federation, BPICA, in this case, they argued strongly. This is sort of the international organization that I looked at. I haven't looked at sort of the CCMC that, for instance, Siegfried had looked at. But they were quite heavy on arguing for harmonization, saying that the Working Party for Construction of Vehicles has done so much good, and we should try to get the US and Japan also involved in this, and that all countries should have the same regulation and should be implemented at the same time. So this was the general idea by the International Federation of National Car Industry Federation Associations. Nevertheless, Sweden goes about to adopt these. In 1972, they decide to introduce US standards for 1973. This is including the driving cycle for Swedish model 1976. The Swedish industry was very critical of the Swedish unilateral approach, and the international industry also criticized Sweden for sort of not following the European development, but instead adopting US regulation. And then came the oil price shocks. So for Sweden, the moving beyond the recently adopted regulation for US regulation for 1973 model year became very difficult, because the next sort of rational step was to introduce catalysts. But this solution was blocked, really owing to the reluctance of phasing out lead within the EEC, but also other countries, as well as a slow tightening of UNEC emission standards. So if Sweden would have adopted catalyst requirements in unleaded gasoline, it would not be possible for Swedes to travel outside of Sweden, which was very common back then, to Norway and to Denmark, but also to Germany for vacation, for instance. They couldn't refuel their vehicles without destroying the catalyst, which would in turn into costly replacements, or just make the catalyst obsolete in a sense. In relation to the energy crisis, the international car industry mobilizes a response, because it's very sort of under a lot of structural pressure, but also under a lot of regulatory pressure to reduce emissions, to increase safety, and to improve fuel economy. So they developed, within the BPICA, developed a policy on regulatory coordination of environmental and energy requirements, saying that governments have to choose which goals to fulfill. So should we reduce fuel consumption, or should we reduce emissions? Because these two goals just do not go well in hand. And so the international car industry is very much involved in trying to cope with these new realities. Meanwhile, in Sweden in 1979, the motor vehicle pollution reaches sort of its post-war peak. It has to do with the new evidence on lead on children's mental and cognitive development. And it also relates to the issue of acid rain, for instance. So it leads to a lot of public and expert concern, and also some discussions within the Swedish political debate, whether to introduce unleaded gasoline because of the issues of lead in children, but also then catalysts to solve motor vehicle pollution. The Swedish industry then mobilized very strongly, and more strongly than I've seen even before or after this, against Swedish unilateralism. So the Swedish industry is a technological leader in the US, but they're saying you should not implement the same norms in Sweden, because we should instead focus on harmonizing with Europe. So the Swedish car industry is very critical of the Swedish approach. The energy crisis also leads the UNEC to lose its central place in terms of vehicle emission governance. WP29 amended Regulation 15 4 times. So there were lower carbon monoxide hydrocarbon standards from 1974. NOx standards were introduced in 1977. Lower limits for all emissions in 1979. But in 1980, they adopted a new regulation, the fourth amendment to Regulation 15, which meant lower carbon monoxide standards, but laxer hydrocarbons and NOx emission standards. So why did it relax the latter part of the standards? It has to do with, in 1979, WP29 get a sort of required from the UNEC top level to begin to evaluate emission reductions against fuel consumption penalties. And lowering hydrocarbons and NOx emissions more would sort of increase fuel consumption. So therefore, they sort of relaxed those standards. But this also caused tension to rise within the UNEC framework, because you still had some progressive countries, Sweden, Switzerland, partly Norway, partly Netherlands, and partly also Germany. Germany, for instance, wanted more stringent standards, but they were not sort of able to do so. Because there were some laggards, specifically the UK, but also the Eastern countries, and then there were some moderates. So it was the rift between them became too sort of broad to overcome. So the negotiations relocated from Geneva to Brussels, which is sort of in the early 1980s, but also to and from Stockholm. So the relocation to Brussels has been studied quite a lot. But why this relocation happened has not really been studied before this. And what happened in relation to Stockholm and Sweden has not either, I would say, been properly explored. So Sweden rallies to progressive states. This is the last slide before the conclusions. Sweden and Switzerland, so as you remember, maybe I didn't say that, but okay, I will just go back quickly, because Switzerland dropped out of Regulation 15 because they wanted progress quicker to adopt Swedish standards. So Swedish and Swiss experts start to negotiate or to essentially develop the new regulation, which they do bilaterally, which also included sort of ways to get type approval in one country for both countries essentially. So it's basically based on Swedish standards from 1976, but also with new in-use compliance criteria. However, both Sweden and Switzerland are sort of, they're not being able to go much quicker without international help. So in 1983, the Swedish Car Exhaust Emission Committee, which was formed in 1977, focuses very hard on catalysts and unleaded gasoline, saying that this is essentially the way we have to go in order to reduce emissions, because the previous emission limits had not managed to actually reduce the emission concentrations. It's just sort of lowered the increase. But to actually reduce the curve, they had to introduce catalysts and unleaded gasoline. So the Exhaust Emission Committee proposes voluntary standards for US 1983 standards and unleaded gasoline for Swedish model year 1988. But the mandatory proposal is from a Swiss standard from 1986, which is in turn developed from US regulation from 1978-79, which in US required catalysts, but the Switzerland did not want to include sort of require unleaded gasoline as well. So this sparked a major criticism from the car industry, saying that we're not going to be able to comply with this without unleaded gasoline. But the major point was that this committee stressed international coordination. And some of the events in 1983 changes sort of the political economy of emission standards in Europe, and also opens possibilities to coordinate on these issues. Norway, for instance, had a similar conclusion as the Swedish committee, and most of the Scandinavian countries are on board with saying that we have to have catalyst and unleaded gasoline. The UK, more crucially, shifts from being very much opposed to phasing out lead because they say that the medical evidence is inconclusive, Two, in 1983, they shift their footing, saying that, okay, the evidence is now conclusive. We have to phase out lead, and we have to sort of ban lead within the European Economic Community in general to protect health. But one important thing is that West Germany also, just in the summer and fall of 1983, West Germany threatens to go it alone in terms of catalyst and US and in implementing catalyst US standards for 1983 and unleaded gasoline to be implemented in 3 years if the EC cannot move quickly enough. What happens then is that both sort of Sweden and Germany, who had the most, some of the countries had the most expertise in terms of regulating and developing regulation on vehicle emissions, they start to interact, and there's high-level negotiations between environmental ministers in Sweden and Germany, saying that we should try to lead Europe in this case. So Swedish expertise becomes at the center of the 1984 Stockholm Group. And the Stockholm Group was composed of EFTA countries, so Austria, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, and the EC countries, Denmark, Netherlands, West Germany, but also Canada. So they start to get together to develop sort of a regulation that would have catalyst and unleaded gasoline as a base. And now when Germany turns, the Swedish industry is no longer critical of the Swedish approach. It pushes on for international coordination to implement stringent standards. And by 1987, Austria, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, and Sweden had issued regulation implying the three-way catalyst and 90% reductions of emissions and unleaded gasoline. Denmark, Netherlands, and West Germany were sympathetic to this event, but were blocked by the 1985 Luxembourg Compromise to introduce catalyst on all cars. So the argument here is that I think that by showing that it was possible to introduce these limits, despite a lot of criticism from the EEC industry and the common market industry, Sweden, along with other countries outside of the EEC, managed to show the way for sort of drastic emission reductions. The EEC followed by decision in 1989 and 1991 to implement similar standards for 1992, 1993. So the first picture I show you. So this is sort of one of the general ideas that countries outside of the EEC managed to lead the EEC in terms of implementing more stringent standards. So the conclusions here. So I think that national efforts to protect the environment were conditioned by discourses on international trade. This is, I think, true in Sweden. But also, if you look at countries outside of Sweden, we can say the Netherlands and Germany, for instance, were trying to push stringent standards, but they had to think about the common market context. But also Switzerland was not part of the common market, could not go further, but tried to go through the Working Party for the Construction of Vehicles instead. In the Swedish case, I think maybe I showed better in the thesis than in this talk that the industry exercised limited power of the standard setting process. So I think that Swedish expertise acted as a quite strong counterpower to business power, because the sort of how they produced knowledge to show that it was actually possible, or at least argued a discursive truth that it was possible to go beyond what the industry said was possible or economically viable. So expertise was important in this. And often I think that Swedish actors that wanted stricter standards were blocked for other reasons than business power exercise. And this has to do, for instance, with the standards fuel infrastructure, as Lorenza actually said from the beginning, that in order to have unleaded gasoline, or in order to introduce catalyst, you need unleaded gasoline. But the thing that actually drove the introduction of unleaded gasoline was the idea to get catalyst as well. So it was a hen and the egg problem, which is similar to electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. So yeah. And I think this is sort of the general, the gist of my thesis. And I would really like to hear your thoughts about what I have said and about the thesis in general. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mattias. Since I'm sure that there will be many comments and questions, I would suggest to go straight into Samuel's discussion and the debate without having a break. Do you agree? Is it okay for you? Okay, so Samuel, I'll leave it to you.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you, Mattias, for this very nice presentation and also for this very nice thesis that I read with many interests. First of all, I would like to congratulate you of this work, which is very interesting, very detailed, and gives many information about this history of the air pollutant emissions. It is a very, very impressive work, and I think it's a very, very important book that you wrote. So I will just have maybe a few comments on your general work, on your thesis. I was very interested on your theoretical framework, and especially on the what you define as linking, that you say that countries are linking together in order to follow one pace instead of another. I think it was very interesting to see how every national regulation can connect each other. And when we read about the European regulation, and especially during this history, we think that Sweden is very isolated and didn't produce its own expertise and just adopt the US or the European regulation. And you show, and that's very interesting, how Sweden managed to produce its own technical knowledge from the very beginning. And so to see that the path that the Sweden follow is not just a compromise between the US and the European regulation, it's a real own national path, which has very important consequence, both for US, but also for the European regulation. So Sweden is not just a small country. It was, when you read your thesis, a very, very important country. I will just have some question about how the Swedish industry adopted the different technologies, like the freeway catalyst. In your thesis, of course, there were some debates, but you show that Volvo was very a leader in this technology and managed to adopt very quickly. Maybe I'm missing some context information about what kind of product, what kind of cars that Volvo produce. Was there like luxury car like Mercedes or BMW, or just popular cars? Because it could explain a lot about the price elasticity of the production, which is a very important factor for this harmonization and the adoption of tight standards. Like, for example, in France, there were some reluctance to adopt the US standards at the beginning because of the specialization of French car manufacturers in small cars. So maybe I would like to hear more about the business model of Volvo, especially. And second, I will have some comments about especially this linking concept that you bring in your thesis. For example, you say at the end that West Germany wanted to go it alone in 1983. Of course, you're right, but we published in a paper with Sigfrido that according to the German VDA, the German Manufacturer Association, they wanted to follow what happened in Sweden and Switzerland. So it was that the West Germany which linked with the Swedish standard. So it's also very interesting to see in your thesis that when you take a national point of view, that every national case, I will say, is part of a big puzzle, which is very interesting to combine. And I hope that one day we can, every scholars in this field can publish a big book about the history of air pollutant emission, because it's very interesting to see how every piece of evidence managed to connect each other. So, for example, the Germany wanted to link or to follow the recent trade in Sweden and Switzerland, and that's why they wanted to go it alone in Europe to adopt unleaded gasoline and freeway catalyst. And also, it was interesting for the car, the German producer, but the German producer wanted the tight standards, US standard, and the harmonization at the European level. So there is also, as you say in your thesis, a very deep connection between international trade and harmonization. Everybody wants to harmonize according to their own standard, as we can say. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I think, of course, your work stopped during the 80s, and one of the biggest leader was Germany, was the German industry, and of course we have to take it into account. As I say in the paper I wrote with Sigfrido, we show how the German industry managed and the German government also managed to impose to the European level a new standard, which is Euro 1 standard during the 90s. So yeah, I would like maybe to hear more about what you read about the specific German industry in your case, how they exchange knowledge with Sweden in order, and how the Sweden interpret the move from the German industry. And I was also very interested in your thesis because it shows that the regulation is not a rational just solution to a problem, because it depends also on how do we problematize, how do we put the problem. You say, for example, which pollutant we have to fight, how do we measure them, how do we, all the technical knowledge in order to put the problem before answering to it. And for example, you say that Sweden was interested into the best available technology principle, but on the other hand, the European Commission chose another principle, which is that the regulation has to follow the technological development. So the regulation has to adapt to what are the past technology. So it's not, you wrote, for example, the debate on technology forcing standard. And so the principle on how we regulate is very important in order to understand the dynamics. And so I would like to hear you more about what you didn't do in your thesis. That means the most recent period of Europe. Maybe you have some opinions about it. For example, the integration of Sweden in the European Union, of course, changed, I think, a lot in terms of regulation, for sure. Also, as you stop at the end of your presentation, the Single European Act, who actively pushed to total harmonization. And now we are into a new kind of principle, which is the best available technology, not exceeding excessive cost, something like that. I would like to know, according to what you know about the Swedish case, how Volvo managed to adapt to this new regulatory framework in terms of technologies. Do they continue to follow their own technological path, or is there some kind of harmonization between the Volvo cars and the European cars, I mean, in terms of technology. And last, I would like to also to hear you about the current debate on CO2 emissions. And as you say, fuel consumption and pollutant is not are problematic altogether because they are connected. And CO2 emission, for example, at the European level is the governance comes from the Environmental Directorate General, but the air pollutant emission still remains on the industry DG GROW, so for internal market. And the way they interpret the regulation is totally different. For the environment, the important is the impact on the environment, so they reduce the CO2 level. But for the European Commission, the only condition is to adopt the best technology. But at least as I wrote in my thesis and in my book, they don't care so much about the level in itself of pollutant. What they want is that just they adopt the best technology. And if it's 60 milligrams or 70 milligrams of NOx, it's not the most problematic for the European Commission because they only want to make an internal market, so to diffuse technology. So I would like to hear if in your thesis and if according to your knowledge on the Sweden, I would like to hear more about the fuel consumption case that you show. How do they interpret and how do they calculate what is the optimal level, for example, of fuel consumption? So technically, how do the regulators take its decision depending on air pollution or CO2 or fuel consumption? Maybe you have some insight about how the regulators calculated the risk and benefit and the cost and benefits of every regulation. So that's just general question, just to start the discussion. And as I said, I was very impressed by your thesis, and it was very, very interesting for me to read your work.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you very much for these questions. I will try to, if there's something I forget to answer, if I interpret something wrong, just please tell me. So I will try to take them in order as I understood them as questions. The idea of linking, I didn't really discuss it here. It's sort of one of the theoretical or analytical frames that I use in the thesis, which comes mostly from the history of technology, which is the idea that markets can be integrated without sort of de jure integration, without formal negotiations between governments. So that is sort of the idea, and I try to look at how linking, in the sense that a shared idea of sort of a shared knowledge production system, and how that sort of integrates Europeans in a shared European experience, which is usually understood in this literature. So it's essentially an idea of how to create knowledge, in my sense, and how to also to establish sort of environmental goals in this sense. So I didn't speak much about it in the presentation. But you had one question about what sort of the cars that Volvo produced and whether or not, say, they were able to solve this issue of catalyst because they were sort of a premium brand, essentially, which they were in the US, and that is sort of their own explanation, that we were able to do this because the added cost wasn't too problematic for us, and that is essentially true. I mean, it was a much bigger obstacle for Chrysler and for GM and for Ford, because they were mass market cars. So they had a problem. There was also some other technical issues because Volvo had an inline engine, which made it easier to place the lambda sensor, which was an important part of this. And if you have a reconfiguration, you have to have two different exhausts, and sort of the oxygen sensor, which made it more difficult to do for the Americans. So I'm not saying that sort of Volvo was. I mean, I can directly link this to sort of one of your latter questions on Volvo and how they try to adapt to sort of new emission requirements. And they are one of few, so I think it's Volvo and Volkswagen, I think it is, that has said, maybe also General Motors, that has said, we will go full electric. And there are a few other companies that have actually said that. And I think at least in the Volvo case, in terms of the catalytic converter, they said that we need to comply with US regulation. And otherwise we will be shut out of the market. And the US market, at least in the 1970s, was quite a big deal for Volvo. There was a lot of exports to the US, and being shut out of that market would have been a big problem. So they sort of had to develop the catalytic converter, if you get my point. And I think it's the same now, that Volvo are seeing where are the sort of regulatory winds blowing, and it's blowing towards electric vehicles. And so they are not big enough to affect sort of at the EU level. So they have to adopt, so go like solve the issue before it really becomes a problem, because they cannot lag out. If they are not able to do it, they will only have the Chinese markets left, although it's a big market, but it's not their, I said, it's their major market in terms of the single country market. But the EU is still sort of the biggest market, so they have to adapt. So they don't really have room to try to say, we're going to lock into this old technology. So I think those two are connected. The thing about sort of, you said something about link with Germany, and Germany wanted to follow sort of the Swiss and the Swedish approach. And I mean, this is, as you said, there's sort of every country is within this sort of big discussions all the time. And here in the 1980s, it's quite an issue of chronology, when and why people wanted to follow who. For instance, the German industry was quite, for a long time, opposed to catalyst and unleaded gasoline until, as you show in your article, of the tax subsidies and so on. But still, the German industry was still divided and so on. So it's, I think the issue has more to do with sort of, it's a very tight chronology. There's a lot of things happening in the 1981 to 1985. There's a lot of things, and you have to like be straight, like really write it down in exactly what order things are happening. So I think maybe that is in response to what you say. You can ask me if there was something that I missed there. So in that sense, I think the German car industry was divided whether or not they should follow US regulation or wanted to promote US regulation. And the Swedish experience in relation to that, they were only focused on that. They were, at least the ministries or agencies were trying to figure out, will the German government actually follow through on this? That was their main concern. Are you serious with this going alone stuff? So they went to Germany quite some times to make sure that they were actually going to do this, because then Sweden could do something. Without Germany, it would not be possible. And then you asked something about how sort of, I wrote here without being able to follow it, how to define the problem. I think you said something about, you said something about the, can you repeat it? It was something about sort of emissions. Sure. And yeah.
Sure. For example, my point is that according to the European Commission, air pollutant emission is a market standard. So they have the principle of best available technology and so on. And so they ask what is the current technology trend, and they put limits depending on what is achievable. But according for the environmental problem, like the CO2 emission, they put limits of emission depending on global emissions, like goals and global goals on emission. And so they ask the car manufacturers to comply. So I would like to know if, for example, the fuel emission, the fuel consumption and the air pollutant emission is in the head of the regulators in Sweden, if the way of calculation, what is the good limits or what is a good regulation, depends in terms of on how do they reflect on it. Do you have any insight about it?
Well, the short answer is no. I haven't really as much studied sort of this more current period. I can do some scientific speculation maybe. And one thing that I think is notable is that CO2 emissions was essentially sort of the environmental goals for cars up until Dieselgate. And that was, I think, the same in Germany, or is it Germany in Europe in general. So at least the subsidies in terms of what it was an environmental car was diesels because they were low fuel. I mean, you know the story that diesels was Europe was a sort of diesel haven, and I think this is the same issue in Sweden, that they were focused just on fuel consumption essentially, and then with the Dieselgate, things turned on its head. So I think also these discussions have to be put in the context of essentially the electrical transformation, because when you have a wholly electric drivetrain, I think this is the idea, at least, that all pollutant will sort of disappear anyway. So it doesn't really, I mean, this is just an intermediate step towards the electric drive. However, there are tons of issues there as well, but I think that okay, just to keep it brief, I don't know enough about the current discussions and the complexities involved, although I think that there's a general focus saying that electric vehicles will solve air pollution, it will solve climate change. Obviously, this is not going to happen, specifically because electric cars, because they're also heavier, emit more PM10 and PM2.5 emissions because they are heavier, and because well, it's the PM emissions from cars are so low in the exhaust pipe anyways. But there are, I would just pass on the question with that. So, and I don't know either the sort of, one thing I know relating to sort of now on the NEDC, the New European Driving Cycle, and the World Harmonized Testing Procedure, VLTP. I mean, there is still issues. I think one thing that I think I show in the thesis, which I haven't really spoke a lot about, is that how you measure really matters, and whether or not you follow up after you have sort of set the type approval standard. You have to follow up this to actually know whether or not these cars pollute, or whether or not they actually consume this much fuel and so on. And this is a major issue with hybrids today, because hybrids are rarely sort of fueled, or fueled with electricity, or at least not to the extent that you would like them to. So the general emissions, everyone knows that. Everyone knows that emissions on the road is much higher, but there is not really a regulatory focus. There is a lot of pressure from interest groups to include this, but there is still, I think it bears a mark of history. Like this is essentially, it's regulated essentially at the same way it was regulated in the mid-1960s. So there's history matters a lot, I think, in these ideas. And also the fact that the United States shifted its driving cycle already in 1975. So the Federal Driving Procedure 1975 looks like the VLTP. It has done so since 1975. But in Europe, they didn't really change that. And one thing also between the difference between the Stockholm group and Germany, as it might have been this you mean, you meant that Sweden wanted to follow US regulation also relating to the driving cycle, because some of the experts believe that with a simple driving cycle, such as the NEDC, it will be easier to install defeat devices. So they sort of already knew that by 1985 or something, that it would be easier to install defeat devices. And I don't know whether this is correlated, but could be. So I think that was most of your questions. Good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mattias. Now we open the floor. We will collect 2-3 comments and then come back to you. Please raise your hand either via Zoom or on the screen. Who wants? Tommaso. Okay, Tommaso and then Sigfrido. Is it okay? Because you raised your hand in the same second.
I raised it first, but Tommaso is the boss, so mine had to be the second.
I'm happy to let Sigfrido start, also because I think that in terms of the historical, the sequence of the question, I think is good to start with, you know,
okay,
from an historical perspective, and then I will perhaps go more on the present situation. So please, Sigfrido, go ahead.
So thank you very much for giving me the floor first, Tommaso, very kind. So I'm very happy to have Mattias presenting in this seminar, because of course we met like a few years ago before all this COVID, and it was me who invited to come to the young authors, young doctoral researchers meeting to Pisa. And it was not still the PhD at the level that is now completed. There was a lot of questions, and indeed one of the major added values that I saw in his doctoral project, which he presented to us, is that for the first time somebody could reconstruct something that I have tried to start with a modest contribution some years earlier, which was this idea of having a global institution where standards can be agreed between states. And this is the United Nations European Commission for Europe Working Party in 29, which I studied the first origins, no, at the end of 49, etc. So, but it has become very important actually. So if there is maybe one aspect where history matters a lot, is the history of technology and the history of standards. You know, is the question of path dependency, QWERTY, all these stories. We know that if historians can be useful for historians of technology and for current debate, is precisely in that field. And Mattias has a great advantage in that he was Swedish, and of course Sweden has been from the very beginning contributing to that working group, which I would like to remember. It was one of the few where standards of automobiles brought together the East and the West. No, that's the reason was displaced, and not, I mean, also the Soviet and the Eastern Bloc automobile states were participating very strongly in this institution. So the history of the institution as such was really important, and the access to the archives that Mattias had from the Swedish governmental part was really crucial for the history of this I would say curious institution, but there is not so many global institutions where the states meet, and where also companies and business business associations are trying to negotiate, you know, beyond the ideological, I mean, the limits that were put by the Cold War. No? So that was really I mean, one of the main points, which I think give us also a derivation what is part of his historiographical contribution. His historiographical contribution is said, but I would like to stress, is that his contribution is now in a new trend of studies, which said that the history of European integration needs to be studied within the larger history of the 20th century, so the interwar, no, the experts, the hidden integration of Europe. It's Johann Scott that we try to invite to our annual conference, who has really put forward that paradigm, not that there is an hidden integration by experts before the political integration, and that integration and this place with all these technical experts interacting in ministries, in scientific bodies or in companies was one of the key places where we can find such an interaction in history. So that's a little bit to give to colleagues who are not historians a little bit why this PhD is very important, because it's making this double contribution to an historiography which is growing. There are some works that now are being most recently also produced on that line. I'm thinking about Laurent Barlousset, recent work also on this issue, or also the PhD in Sorbonne, that came from time to time to our conference, who has just finished her PhD and is dealing a little bit with this issue also of technological standards of the automobile industry at the European Union level. One question now, that's a general comment, because I saw that it was also supposed to be discussant, so I wanted a little bit to make clear for those who are not historians, which I think is the majority, and that's maybe the added values of GERPISA, that we take history seriously. Also, the work of historians is well received here, and we think that the colleagues here who are not historians are genuinely interested on knowing how they can enrich their own reflection with this historical contribution. So that's the first thing. The second thing, more precisely, is that I wanted, maybe the question more precisely is again on the issue of Volvo. Volvo is a very peculiar company still today, but at the time was very peculiar because, of course, it was a Swedish company with a lot of growing interdependence with the US market. But of course, it was also a European company, European Union company, or European Community company, because it was owning a truck company in the Netherlands, And in this sense, it was included among the founders of the Common Market Committee of Automobile Producers, the antecedent of ASEA, and actually his CEO, Per Ligenhammer, became one of the key persons in creating this antecedent of the European Roundtable of Industries that he then preceded. So Volvo is a very important company in this history, in the whole history of the integration of Europe through big companies and big multinationals. So the question would be, did you have the opportunity to see internally within Volvo, what was the discussions between the various sections of the company, the various, because typically, I mean, in GERPISA, we are generally very much interested in the companies, in the functions of the company, the engineers, the commercial, the more general public relations, lawyers of the company. So that's something which is maybe important for us to know. How was managed that internally? I remember that you were trying to get access to the archives of Volvo. I think it was very difficult actually to get access to them. But yeah, what is the internal debate, and how you would feature a little bit the figure of Ligenhammer? I know that they're asking you something maybe beyond of the PhD, because of course the added value of the PhD also is the role of experts. And I think with the COVID, we are seeing the importance of experts, in front of economic interests and the interaction and with the political power. So I think your PhD, apart from the automobile, is very trending with what we are living today. But this more particular question would be: did you manage to find a little bit how the Volvo leadership was trying to integrate these various contrasting objective interests that they have between the US, in domestic politics in Sweden for stricter emissions control, and then the European Union, in which Volvo was playing an important role. Just to remind that Volvo and Renault had in the 70s a joint company of engines, of gears, of automatic gears, a common company. So the association between French companies and Volvo was, and particularly Renault, has been very long from that moment, from the early 70s. And of course, there was another example of a technology that was supposed to be the future, and actually didn't really go very, very far in Europe. That's another story. But just to say that Volvo has anticipated this integration of the Swedish automobile industry in Europe, so to say, before enlargement. So that was rather my question. Sorry, I've been very long, as you as often. Sorry.
Tommaso, then I was trying to raise my hand to book a place after Tommaso, but then there's also Olger that wants to contribute. So if Mattias is okay, we take this 4, and then we come back to you. Tommaso, please. You're mute.
Yes, I activate my microphone. So yeah, I would also really like to thank Mattias for his work that I haven't read yet, but I would definitely do. I think this is a crucial topic, and perhaps we will say that in the 21st century, this will become the most important topic for the automotive industry. I mean, it's already the case, but we have a history here that shows something that was important, but I think the industry managed successfully to control that. And now it's becoming even more important. And one of the questions we are asking in GERPISA now is whether or not the industry will be able, again, to control this transition so that it's not disruptive to the industry itself. So I have several questions, and so I try to keep short. So the first question is that I got the impression, without reading your work, that you're saying that the governments, the states, are divided in terms of what they want to do for different reasons, but that the industry seems kind of homogeneous. You insist that even in Sweden, that the Swedish automotive industry was against, that even in Germany, it was divided but fundamentally against. And this is, I mean, this to me a little bit problematic, because my view of, in particular, these periods is an industry that is fragmented by national champions with governments that are very close to their industry. And we are moving towards a more integrated European transnational companies, but this is the process we're looking at. And so my feeling was that the companies were very much also divided and having different views on that. And I will go back to the question about Volvo. Volvo was a premium car maker, and together with Saab, Mercedes, or Volkswagen, were the main exporter of cars outside Europe, and mainly to United States. And clearly for Volvo, California was a crucial market. So it was a matter of survival for Volvo to create this technology and to take the lead. Actually, it was Volvo was the first one to come up with the technological solutions. But I got the feeling by reading other works that they also cooperate with German car makers and also German supplier. I heard that Bosch was part of the technological development. And this suggests the coalition that Sigfrido has really highlighted in his work, that you have these premium exporters located in Germany or Sweden that also are supported by their government with a liberal view of Europe, in which Europe is conceived as the common market is conceived also as a place where you could negotiate the opening of the US market, or anyway, they were much more reluctant to open the single market, no, the common market to US, for instance, even if the US car makers were present. So for them, the idea of integrating regulation with the US standards was coherent with the export strategy of these premium car makers. While the French and Italian car makers had a completely different view about the common market. And so it was more about creating a space protected for them, and in which the American threat and then the Japanese threat would be kept under control. And so the whole process of integration was a struggle about defining how the regulation would work. And of course, the environmental regulation are very important. So do we go to the S standard? We go in another way? How we deal with that? So that would be my first question, is that I got this impression from your analysis. Am I right or wrong? What do you think about that? Then one interesting story about that you have highlighted a little bit, but I think you could perhaps stress a little bit more, is the fundamental contradiction between the two problems of air pollutant and consumption that then becomes the CO2 problem. So air pollutant, if you're producing heavy cars, that's not a big deal because you filter them. So it doesn't matter the volume of your air pollutant. You can have very heavy cars, like premium cars, and then you can integrate the three-way catalyst or other technology to filter these particles. So premium brands have been on the forefront, and they appear early on as green producer because they could filter particles. But then when you move to consumption, then they are those who have problems. So if you want to reduce consumption, well, you have to produce compact cars, light cars. And that is the same for CO2 in theory, I mean, in practice. If you consume less, then you emit less. And so to me, this is an interesting story because the diesel as a technological solution is a sort of compromise that has allowed premium car makers to kind of keep doing what they were doing, heavy, powerful cars. But with the diesel technology, they were able to green their cars because it consumed less. And also diesel makes cars more expensive. So initially, at least, it was very current with the kind of German view of the technology. The problem is that diesel emits more air particles. We know that. And the Dieselgate actually exploded because of this contradiction, because when Volkswagen tried to sell diesel cars in the United States, well, it was faced with a regulation where air pollutants is much more important than consumption. And so when they tried to put their diesel cars in conformity with the US standards, well, it was too much, and it turned out that they were actually cheating. So I think this contradiction now reemerged with electric cars, because Volvo typically was one of the worst CO2 performer while in Europe. But if you go electric, then again, you have a magic solution, which is similar to the three-way converter, to make your big, heavy cars green again. And this creates new problems. So I think this parallel history of air pollutant, which have become very important in the United States and shaped the regulation there. And in Europe was more about consumptions since the beginning. And so the Euro standards were important, but the idea, the CO2 standards in Europe are much more demanding than in the United States. I think this two parallel history is interesting about how you can shape regulation in very different ways, depending on the history of the path dependencies of that. Third question is about the expertise. I didn't get from your presentation, because of course it was very, what is your conclusion about, I mean, I understood that you think the role of expertise has been very important, but how expertise have changed, how it is organized. It is a public expertise that comes from university, research center. It is more or becoming a private expertise. Is the industry participating in the expertise? It is more from, I mean, it is connected to environmental. Now we see in Europe the role of environmental NGOs is very important. What is also the role of political parties like green parties? That do they have there is a different political spectrum to these questions. So I think the connection of expertise with private, public, and different political view can be of interest to us, because I think now this is a big black box. We know that expertise plays an important role in the European Union, but we don't have really a lot of research that focus on the experts themselves. So that could be interesting insight. And then just a small question of detail. You said the German industry was divided in 1983, 84. Can you be more precise? It was divided between whom and whom? I mean, who was for, who was against, and how these, how do you find traces of this debate, where it was taking place? And so if you can give more information about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Mattias, we continue with these other couple of questions and then we pass it to you. So I have a quick question and a comment. So I'm not an historian, I'm a political economist, and I worked quite a bit on state business relations. So I was reflecting on your conclusion that in the case you analyzed, the industry had limited powers in terms of on the standard setting process. And so my open question is, if we had to generalize this relation, the power balance, does it depend on the strength of the state? Does it perhaps depend also on the nature of the standards that are discussed? What I mean is, is it possible that in the end, the industry plays a much stronger lobbying power when there are other standards involved? Because in the end of the day, there are other interests involved when it's not about environmental standards or labor standards, or depending on the specific interests involved. So this meaning is not exactly the power of the industry per se, but what is discussed that determines the balance of power. I don't know if this is convoluted. Or, for example, it also depends on the ownership of the industry we're talking about, whereby some national or multinational companies may be interested in pushing more on this standard setting process, depending on the state. I'm reflecting to see if we can draw some general conclusions on the power balance between the two. The other thing is just a comment that I would like to, from the point of view of someone who studies extra-European industry, more the European industry, I think it would be very interesting. Maybe there's less market for research on in this regard, but it would be interesting to have more studies, not only on the period you analyzed, but of course on this recent period of the discussions on the just transition, to analyze more the impact of the European standard setting or the Western standard setting processes on the rest of the world, not only because this impacts the kind of models and the kind of production that then is assigned to production nodes outside of Europe and in emerging countries, but also because this, as we've seen before, this determines a shift of used cars, for example, from core production countries to extra-European countries that embrace this setting, the standards later. And there is a problem that we have discussed a lot with regards to Africa or Asia as well, an inflow of used cars that pollute way more. That is incredible and is difficult to contain. So this is more of a comment. We still have Olger, and then we go back to Mattias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening from Japan. Since I introduced that I'm here in Japan, of course, my question is also related to Japan. And first of all, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And specifically to the time span, so since the 1960s, 80s, you researched, we have the rise of the Japanese car industry. And we have that the first cars that met the American standards was the Honda Civic, and followed by the Mazda rotary engine. And so my question is, what was the impact of this developments that the Japanese, became a main player in the global area of car production on setting of standards, for instance? And the other question which is related to that, the approach of the Japanese was, and this was a guideline particularly of Honda Soichiro, to meet the American standards without any additional technical development. So based on the engine technology at that time to meet the standards, the American standards. So what was the impact of the Japanese car industry, and how did it influence maybe also some kind of standard setting in Europe or in the US? Thank you very much.
I should just take the notes here so I remember it.
Mattias, feel free to select what you want to address, because we understand that you had at least 20 questions in the end.
Yeah, sure. But
sorry.
They're good questions. So first to Sigfrido, nice seeing you again. And also thank you all for very, very good questions. Regarding the internal, the situation was same now as it was before, that I haven't been able to access the archives of Volvo. I think, however, that we actually need to make a distinction between Volvo and the CEO Peg Gyllenhammar, because he's really an institution of its own. So he was very much like sort of a state builder or a policy entrepreneur, and so he wasn't really very much involved in these issues that I discussed, although without looking at the internal documents, obviously. But one thing, he was involved in the late 1970s. I showed you that the Car Industry Association had sort of a major campaign trying to oppose the specifically, they wanted to turn Sweden more to sort of a car-friendly society, because they believed that regulations targeting Sweden was really putting a heavy strain on the Swedish car market and therefore also the car industry. So then Gyllenhammar was in the papers saying that we can't have catalyst and unleaded gasoline in Sweden. So this is really the only time. What I know, at least from my supervisor, or my former then supervisor, managed to interview Gyllenhammar, and he didn't really stress any of these issues. He wasn't really, although he's very old now, so it's difficult to tell, but he wasn't really, as I understand it, not very much involved. And as I interviewed some people on Volvo, they said really that what Gyllenhammar and the manager said to the technicians, saying that we have to get into the US market, like Tommaso was saying, that we have to make it or break it in a sense. But the internal discussions, I don't know, and there were probably some divisions, but Volvo is generally known for sort of their engineering culture and sort of trying to solve issues based on an engineering sort of rationale. So there are no problems, there are just solutions in a sense. But more than that, I cannot really say about how they thought about policy on Europe and the US. Although I should say that what happened with the energy crisis, because of the sort of the decline of the sales to the US, Volvo refocused towards Europe and put more production into Europe. So likely Gyllenhammar already then, by the late 1960s, were focusing on Europe more and saying that the US is too sort of unstable. We can get some premium profits from there, but Europe is our real market. That's what I think, at least. So I think also that is why that they thought that European harmonization is more important than us having a technological leadership in Sweden, being able to sort of use the catalytic technology ahead. To Tommaso, I think, I mean, of course, you're right. This also has to do with the point I just answered, that I haven't really been able to look at specifically at various core industry, only at the sort of peak level association. So I haven't been able, and there I must say, there are very few times when they are in disagreement, although it might not be left in the minutes. But still, I would just assume that at least in the Swedish setting, they probably on the grander issues they were sort of thinking along the same lines. But as you know, as from Sigfrida's research and so on, and from others, I mean, there's been a lot of, I mean, the reason why they created ASEA, for instance, was because of the major conflict within the CCMC. So, of course, they were divided. And regards to the what the German sort of, when I said that they were divided, I haven't looked at it. I have used other people who have studied it, and it said the premium manufacturers, BMW, Mercedes, they were sort of less in opposition and less of an obstacle to the German government than, for instance, Opel and Volkswagen, for instance. So of course they were divided, but I don't know more from what I've read in the secondary literature, in a sense. So let's see. About the trade-offs between emissions and carbon monoxide. I mean, what you're pointing to, I think, is the general conception that goes through all these debates about the technological fix and sort of the ecological modern or eco-modernism, as it's called, that we can solve very complex environment. First, we can understand very complex environmental problems by putting grams per kilometers in front of it or after it, in a sense, and then we can solve it by technology. And that is a big issue in the history of technology, but also in other areas, which I think it's difficult. And as you say, that I wrote a paper with my supervisor called "Safe Before Green" about Volvo, where the argument was that they were sort of green pioneers in the 1970s, but then turning to when fuel economy became an issue, they were sort of at the bottom. So we're trying to explain how the incentive structure and sort of the economics of making cars look like, and why it's difficult for premium car manufacturers such as Volvo to reduce the fuel consumption, because by making cars bigger, heavier, they could make profit, but they couldn't make them greener in a sense. And as you say, it's easy to sort of clean them, and it's the same with going electric. I mean, I think this is an article of yours, right? That sort of they pushed the premium, the electric cars is sort of in the premium scale of in Europe, but we still have sort of the dirty emissions or fuel polluting on the lower segments. About the role of expertise, sort of what is expertise and what are experts? And I think that, I mean, there is, in my case, and I think in my case, the experts were essentially, I mean, most of them were government technocrats, environmental technocrats in a sense, and they were taken as the experts. The industry didn't really have much to say because, first of all, they didn't really create sort of an opposing research. They didn't really conduct their own research in order to use that research to say, hey, you're wrong or something. So, I mean, it also has to do with the corporative structure of the Swedish system as well. And this, I think, is a response fairly to Lorenza's point as well. I mean, so there were quite clear cuts who was supposed to do what. In the US, for instance, the US industry was very much in favor of producing their own research and trying to show that these pollutants aren't as bad, or we have so on. So expertise in that sense was a bit more difficult to point out. But in my case, most of the experts, there was some sort of independent from the state also, but most of them were decided to be experts by the government, saying that you should act as the expert of this investigation, for instance. So I think that I've written an article with a colleague called Sabine Pittelu, and which is now under review, at least for the first time in business and politics, where we try to develop the idea of sort of what's it called? I don't remember now the theory, but the idea, at least, is that you have expertise that is free from sort of industry interference in a sense. So it's objective. It could be taken as objective, although it's obviously not objective. But it's the idea how governments can use various forms of knowledge and how it should be produced in order to bring about change, in a sense. So I think that maybe some responses. And to Lorenza, how to generalize it. And I think that of course, it depends on the role of the state, as you're pointing out, and how the structure of the, as I said, the Swedish system was a corporatist system. To some extent, it wasn't corporatist in that sense that the labor organizations had much to say, but the regulations were sort of developed between the industry and the experts from the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance. And I also think that I use a technology or a theoretical notion of technological power, because usually, I mean, as you say about the standards, yes, the standards matter. And environmental standards are generally more technologically complex, or they rely on both technological and scientific knowledge. And specifically about the applied technological knowledge, that is where the industry has most power. So in a sense, it would be that the industry could influence this development more. This sort of could be a general idea about environmental regulation, that they are the ones that innovate to solve environmental problems. They're also the ones who put it on the market. So they have very much control over sort of environmental regulation in that sense. But then, so with that, I used to, as opposed to that, the sort of the Studsvik laboratory, the ways in which Sweden went about to produce similar knowledge, but free from industry interference in that sense. So, I mean, I think it is generalizable in the sense that you have to have, I mean, from the European perspective, I mean, the really idea is to lower the standards now. And I think knowledge production now within Europe is essentially sort of a multi-produce, although the industry has a lot of stakes in some of the general directorates as well. But there's a lot of different forms of experts in terms of the transport and environment, the NGO, and a number of these different experts. But I think that states still matter, and I think that states could have the opportunity to produce objective knowledge, meaning that technical and applied knowledge that could be produced in sort of a state laboratory that is free from, that is trying to be sort of objective. And I think that's what I show in the thesis. So, but apart from that, I mean, if it's difficult to speak about, there are quite different ways in which standards are produced within the EU now than they were previously. So it's much more complex, I think, and maybe more opaque in one sense, although there's much more insights from external groups. But as I said, I'm not really an expert on the now as an historian, although I would like to do more research on how the process actually works, and specifically in relation to Sweden. Maybe this was someone else, maybe it was Thomas who asked it, or someone else. Nevertheless, Sweden stopped producing this knowledge, with at least through the Studsvik laboratory in 2002, when it was sold. Sort of the function of the Studsvik laboratory was sold to a German company. So now it's just the sort of, for new proposals, they are procured. The information is procured from outside. So there's not a function in the US setting which fills what the Studsvik laboratory had done previously. So when Sweden entered the European Union, they stopped sort of having that technological advantage, or knowledge advantage, at least, at least in my mind. And to Holger, oh, sorry, I would just, about the more studies of European standards. There is quite a lot of research on how sort of the European Union has exported standards in order to so there are essentially three forms. There are Japan, US, and then it's Europe, in Europe and in Asia, and in I think maybe elsewhere too, could be also in Southern America. I don't remember exactly, but there's quite some literature about how the EU has exported standards, and also how what is it, the equipment manufacturers, for instance, and others in foreign countries have adopted the EU regulation, and this relates to the California effect hypothesis, if you know about that one. So there's quite some literature, although how sort of how used cars are shipped to lesser developed economies. I don't know if there's enough research on, but quite some about how the EU has exported its standards across the globe. And then to Holger, Japan is obviously very important here. And the Japanese industry, as you say, was sort of at the Japanese threat was a major one in these days. And one thing that Japan actually, I don't discuss as much in the thesis, but Japan actually adopted sort of the same Clean Air Act amendment standards as the US and actually implemented it before it was ready to do so. But the US threatened with sort of export restrictions, saying that you have to push the implementation because we're not done yet. So there were quite some issues there. And as you say, I mean, the Japanese had some as the Honda CVCC engine, for instance, managed to comply with the early versions of the Clean Air Act amendments. But I don't think actually after when it became in 1983, when the amendments were finally implemented, that they could actually manage without catalysts. I don't think so. So quite a while, I think they could, but not to like the lower NOx limits. I don't think they could manage that without catalysts actually. So, but the Japanese threat is a major one in this, and there's a lot about research on how to Europe and US protecting from this threat in a sense, but they were also technologically leaders in that sense. So I think that it was most of the questions, maybe not 20, but a couple of them at least.
Thank you very much, Mattias. We have only Samuel who wanted to raise the last point, and then I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but after this, we will come to a closure. Please, Samuel.
Okay, no, it just comments on or just an answer to the Tommaso's question on the German industry position on the air pollutant emission. We wrote with Sigfrido in our article. There are some insight about how the German industry react to the tighter emission standard in US. And it's very interesting to see how the position of the German industry change almost every day, depending on the political announcement. For example, we have some clues that Volkswagen and Audi already developed three-way catalyst reductors. That for Mercedes, the added cost of the US regulatory was $10,000 for each cars. So it's quite important. And the position of the automotive industry, the German automotive industry, was the internal market first, so the European market first, before any change in regulation. And they deeply changed their mind on the government announced the fiscal policy, and they were they totally agree, and finally they find every technology, suitable technology, to comply with the German government US and the US regulation. So it's just some insight about the debate inside the German car manufacturers, and also the changing position of this industry towards the US limitation, which is very important to understand what happened during this period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mattias, for your presentation, Samuel, for your discussion, to all of you for participating. Our seminars will restart with a first date in the new year on the 4th of February. You will find the calendar on our website. Just one announcement since we're here. We, as GRPISA, we are about to launch 2 new projects, 2 working groups. One on the global auto industry, focusing on global value chains, emerging players, and the global south. A second one on work in the international automobile industry. These groups will have a first meeting in the end of January. We'll announce the date. If you are interested in participating, this will be some discussion groups to build together panels for the next JERPISA colloquium, whose call will be circulated early next year. And build also joint publications, other seminars, etc. If you are interested, please get in touch with us. All our contacts are on JERPISA's website, so please get in touch, leave your mail, and you will receive a link to attend the first meeting in early 2022. I think this is it. Anybody else want to say anything? Otherwise, enjoy your break. Merry Christmas. Tommaso, you have the last word.
No, just you said it's true that the English International Seminar restarts the 4th of February, but we have the international conference linked to the steering committee that we do virtually the 13th and 14th of January. And we will have a 6th presentation on the changing role of the state after the COVID and with electrification in United States, China, Japan on the 13th. And no, sorry, Germany, France, and Italy on the 13th of January, and United States, China, and Japan on the 14th. And you can already find information on the internet side. There will be more about the program the following days, and you will receive shortly a newsletter with all this information if you're a member of the JERPISA org site.
Can I just say thank you very much for a stimulating discussion. I very appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mattias. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Bye-bye, everybody.
Merry Christmas, stay safe.